dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your remastered host, Madelyn.
I'm your remade host, Emma. I'm a new woman.
Ported to a new system. And
now playable on the Switch.
Coming soon to next gen.
Yep.
And welcome to a side quest episode of the podcast. This week, it's week 1 of the side quest cycle, so it's my turn to choose the topic that we're gonna discuss from all sorts of different angles over the next some amount of minutes. And this time, I decided that I wanted to talk about remakes and remasters of video games. I was not, and Emma doesn't seem to remember either, but I'll let you jump in. We've talked about this on discrete episodes of the podcast before.
Yeah.
Because, of course, every game that we talk about has a remake or a remaster somewhere in its history, honestly, at this point. But I was thinking, we've definitely talked about this on a side quest before. But we haven't. We've talked about sequels, we've talked about, DLC, but we haven't talked about remakes.
I think we maybe talked about it a little bit at some point when we were doing the news magazine format.
That sounds plausible.
Yeah, during one of the, in the news segments, maybe. But we definitely haven't talked about it in this format, which makes it totally fair game, in my opinion, so.
You also mentioned in our notes that we did a Yakuza episode, which was not something I remembered.
Oh, it was episode 15. It's way back there, so.
Right. Deep in the archive.
Yeah.
So what sparked this for me was partially just thinking about, obviously, kind of what are some topics we haven't talked about for the side quest yet. But there's been a lot of remakes and remasters that have been in the news lately. I mean, always, right? But I feel like I've been noticing it even more and more, especially in this past couple of months, with the announcement of the new Super Mario 3D All-Stars, with Tony Hawk Pro Skater finally coming out, with me playing a bunch of remade games recently, in a way that I hadn't as much in the past year or so. So it was just something that was more on my mind. And the more I talked about it and the more I wrote in our shared Google Doc, the more I was like, wow, there's actually a lot to mine here and a lot of different ways to think about this. So yeah, unless you're the New York Times, in which case the only way to think about it is, I hate it. They have this article talking about, from just last month, talking about remakes and remasters. Oh, I have to open it again just to read.
Yeah, I tried to look at that, but I don't have a Times subscription.
I don't either, so we're gonna burn through another free article looking at this for a second time, but that's okay. Alright, so here's the opening for this, just to really set the mood of how the mainstream media wants to talk about this before we get niche up in here. Nostalgia has always been a powerful source of revenue for Hollywood. Turns out it's equally lucrative for video games. This is from August 1st, 2020. Just want to put that out there. From the beginnings, with the likes of Pong, a two-dimensional table tennis game, the video game industry has grown into a $120 billion business. Over the years, memorable games have garnered strong followings, etc.
Yeah, I always feel with articles that's big about video games in the Times or newspapers like that, they always feel they have to introduce the video game industry again at the start. They have to be
as a reminder, this is a serious industry.
Yeah. And it feels maybe you don't have to do that anymore.
It does feel like a McSweeney's piece or an Onion, a good piece for a humor magazine would be writing about television.
Yeah.
Like a video game. From humble beginnings, with the train driving through the screen.
Yeah.
Anyway, I had to talk about that a little bit, because it does represent, this article goes on to represent, what feels like to be a pretty mainstream take on remakes and remasters, in games and across media, which is that it's all about those nostalgia dollars. That when you're remaking something, it's just about tapping into that fan base and mining their nostalgia and their attachment to characters and settings and games from their childhood or their college good old days or whatever it is for however old you are, and sapping them for money.
I mean, and it's not like there's not any truth to that, right? Like when a remake or a sequel to a popular franchise is always going to be an easier sell than an entirely new IP. Unless you have some pedigree on that new IP that can be used to tap into nostalgia also. But yeah, like there's some element of truth to that, right? Like it's an easier sell because people know theoretically what they're getting, right?
Right. And I'm not coming here to say that's wrong. I mean, that's definitely right. But there's a cynical take to that and there's a non-cynical take to that. I think there's a combination for any of these remasters that you see, right? The cynical take is, well, we're just pumping them for something that they love and we're not going to do any real work on it. It's just like a cash grab. And there is that. And I'm sure that's a motivating factor beyond plenty of things. But I don't think it's cynical to acknowledge that new IP is riskier.
Yeah.
And working from existing characters and existing setup is not only easier from a commercial standpoint, but I imagine in many ways is easier on developers.
This is getting slightly off topic, but I did think it was really funny when Atlas put Persona 4 on PC and we're like shocked that it sold well, it seems like. Like it really feels like people want these games on PC and other systems. Like they just seem so baffled by like the success of it when it just seems like, come on, Atlas, that's common sense. Please.
I mean, I guess sometimes people just aren't checked in.
Do you see... Does anyone check your Twitter account? Because I'm pretty sure literally everything you tweet has at least like 50% people asking for Persona 5 on Switch. So... I don't know where the memo was. It got lost somewhere.
It's in somebody's office that they haven't been to in 6 months. Like pinned to the wall.
Exactly.
So let me take a step back a little bit. That was like diving right in to some of the heart of the discussion around this. But taking a step back to just talk about like, okay, like what are we talking about here? And what's the difference and how are we using these words? Because there's a lot of really blurry distinctions between remakes and remasters and ports, and you have something else in your notes, I feel like. Definitive editions. And there's really kind of like blurry boundaries between those. But fortunately, what is Wikipedia for if not giving me a definition? So Wikipedia, on their page on video game remakes, which yes, they do have, defines a video game remake as a video game closely adapted from an earlier title, usually for the purpose of modernizing a game for newer hardware and contemporary audiences. Typically, a remake of such game software shares essentially the same title, fundamental gameplay concepts, and core story elements of the original game.
See, I think the first sentence is a better definition than the second sentence.
I agree. The second sentence introduces some stuff that I'm like, well, I can think of counterexamples to all of those.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that what they're trying to say is it's recognizably the same game.
Yeah.
In some capacity or another. But then I do think that they kind of, shot themselves in the foot a bit by getting too specific.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how I feel about it, too.
And I hadn't really thought about the history of remakes and remasters as I was planning for this, really. I was just mostly thinking about, like, what have I been playing? But it was interesting to me to be reminded that, of course, the first, remakes were taking arcade games and bringing them to early consoles. So one of the very first is Atari's remake of Space Invaders for the Atari 2600 in 1980, which was, like, wildly successful. So it's weird to think about, like, even in the 80s, doing remakes was, like, already this, like, a cash cow of a thing.
Yeah.
And of course, that's in some ways that's very different from, like, how and why remakes are done now. right? Bringing something from an arcade to a console is such a foreign idea now.
Yeah. Well, there's still arcade games made.
I know there are, but it's interesting to think about it as like you're developing a new audience on console,
Yeah,
as opposed
that's
to
true.
like with where your main audience before was arcade. So obviously a very different kind of ethos there, but the same ethos of making a bunch of moolah. And so that was a big part of the early history of remakes. I sort of also hadn't realized that, like, one of the most popular of these kind of, like, early days, I say early days, like, the 90s, like, that was that far ago, but whatever, of these early days was the original Super Mario All-Stars, which took, like, you know, the first 3 Mario games from the NES and brought them to 16-bit and was, like, super successful. So super interesting as we're now seeing Nintendo do that again.
Was it also only available for 6 months?
Believe it or not, I don't think so. Don't think there was a time limit on that one.
I've heard people postulate, and I think this is probably correct, that they're selling it as a 3-pack, right. And then they're going to sell them individually afterward for like a little bit more than you would get them bundled. But it really feels like they should be upfront about that.
Yeah, if it's not that, they are entering a new frontier of weirdness.
And if it is, it still feels a little bit like side-eye.
You know what? We're going to get it here. They've got us on the nostalgia front. They've got Clickbait Boyfriend on the nostalgia front. Like, I mentioned to him, like, kind of offhand as like, oh, like, what a weird bit of gaming news. And he was like, well, we're getting it, right?
You just gotta hop on it, though.
Well, you know,
no dilly-dallying around.
He's not enjoying The Witcher 3, so we need a different game.
Oh, man. Oh, no.
I'll save that for in 6 weeks, I guess, in 4 weeks. Another thing I thought was interesting, though, from history before we jump to, like, other more modern topics, is that even in, like, that kind of late 80s, early 90s, already there was this desire to remaster for better graphics. But then it was, like, on the same system. Like, there were some remakes that were made, like, of a game on a console for that same console. Which is crazy to think about how fast people were getting better at things.
Yeah.
That you had a desire and ability to remake something on the same hardware because you'd figured out how to do it better.
I'm very curious, like, what... And I have no idea how this would be documented. I mean, I guess there was early internet around then, but I'm not super familiar with, like, where the gamers of the 90s posted their complaints. But I wonder if there's any, like pushback against that, right? Like, for people who bought the first version, and then they were like, we're remaking it, but better. And they're like, hey. Or if they were just excited to get more from a game they liked, or something.
Where's my next gen upgrade? My same gen upgrade?
Yeah.
And then obviously in the 90s, with the popularity of the CD-ROM, oh, wow. Like, you could add voices, and, like, also emulation started to become a thing. So that's when remakes really started to take off and explode, because with those two things, it became really, really appealing and much easier to bring old properties forward. And now here we are. Every game is a remake.
Yeah. Every single one.
No new games anymore.
Nope.
They've been canceled. So Emma, I know you've kind of, like, outlined this a little bit, so I'll throw this to you. Do you want to, like, talk a little bit about the difference between a remake and a remaster, and this kind of, like, very specific definitive edition and a port?
Sure. So these are just, like, when I hear these words, it's like my gut feeling of what it means, right? And it obviously means something different for each game that's using them. Unfortunately, for consumers, I guess. But when I hear remake, I generally think that things are kind of rebuilt from the ground up to a certain extent. So things are probably going to be changed or added or adjusted to varying degrees, right? Like, it's a remake is something like super significant in the difference between the original and the remake. A remaster is just making like what already existed look prettier, and possibly like sort of adjusting slight things like clunky controls or bad UI or something, but that's like an extra bonus. Usually remaster just means it looks kind of prettier. Definitive editions are possibly remasters, possibly either ports or re-releases onto the same system that's bundled with like the DLC that's come out. So this isn't just the word definitive, like you'll get Game of the Year edition or something edition, basically. Or in like Kingdom Hearts, it's like final remix or whatever. But some sort of thing tagged onto the end there. And then a port, I pretty much assume will be exactly the same, just it works on a different console.
And I think overall that lines up well with kind of my gut feeling when I see these words on paper or on a box or any of that kind of stuff. I will say, though, like I was saying, so many games really walk a fine line. So I'm thinking of, I think I played this during pandemic. Gosh, it's been, time is whatever. But Link's Awakening, the new one for the Switch.
Yeah.
It's like, adds a teeny tiny bit of content, right? There's like a new mini game, little bit of UI stuff.
Yeah, but the graphics are 100% different.
I know, but for me, remaster mostly deals with graphics.
But it's like the entire art style of Link's Awakening is different in the remake.
I know, but I do.
It's
still
not
feel
just like they made it prettier.
I'm with you. I do still feel like it's a little bit more of a borderline case for me. I know it's not.
I have no problem calling that a remake, even if there's no new content.
But that's the point that I'm making, though, is that especially when it deals with changing graphics, there's a lot of kind of wiggle room about how you might talk about it, which can be confusing in games media, right? And sometimes, I mean, not intentionally so most of the time, I don't think, but sometimes misleading in games media of what you're getting. And all this to say, because remake encompasses so many things, right? Even if I'm with you, and I'm not 100, I think it might just be a remaster plus for me, but whatever. Even if I'm with you, that something like, okay, we can agree to disagree. You're making a face at me. But even if I were to say, okay, yes, Link's Awakening, definitely a remake, which, fine, whatever, I can say that, that's fine. Junior remake for me. There's like no standard expectation for that, because on one hand you have remake like that where it's like, well, the game is basically the same, they've just like totally arted it up, right?
Sure.
And then on the other hand we have something like, and of course we're going to talk about this, it's in the freaking title, we have something like Final Fantasy VII Remake that not only has the art style, obviously jumped forward 2 decades, right?
Yeah.
And it's voice acted and all that good stuff, but they've just totally made it clear that it's going in a different direction. I guess spoilers follow for Final Fantasy VII Remake, although we've talked about it on the podcast now, so yeah. If you're a listener, you're already spoiled. So that word remake encompasses such a wide variety of changes that it does start to feel like, well, it's hard for that to mean very much.
Sure. I
do think Final Fantasy VII is interesting because they do put remake in the title. But as I was reading, I was looking at that Wikipedia page about video game remakes just because that's where I wanted to start. And they talk about on that page, like, it's distinct from a reboot, right? A remake and a reboot are different.
Yeah.
And I actually think Final Fantasy VII Remake is more of a reboot than it is a remake.
Sure.
Which is just interesting because it's in the title, but it's wrong.
See, I don't really think it's a reboot either. I think it's too close. I think reboot is like the Devil May Cry that Ninja Theory made. The one with the black hair, angsty Dante that everybody hated for some reason. It's like that one is like, it's Devil May Cry, but it's so fundamentally different from Devil May Cry. And Final Fantasy VII Remake is not fundamentally different from Final Fantasy VII.
Well, except that the combat is totally different and the story looks
it's not. It's not fundamentally different.
Fair enough. Fine. But again, Emma and I quibbling about this vocabulary just once again underscores the point of there's no firm definition for these words.
Well, I mean, it's like when we talked about genre, right? Like, there's just not a way... You can't have words that are that precise.
Fair enough. So there's so much I want to talk about here. There's so many different areas. But I started talking about Final Fantasy VII, so I might as well talk about this now. First of all, I was just thinking about this today. Remember, like, months before it came out, when everybody was like, oh, don't spoil the new fans about Aerith. Don't tell them what happens to her. Keep the secret. And now, like, if somebody tells me that she died, like, it would be a spoiler.
Yeah.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
Like, before the game came out, everyone was like, don't spoil the 20-year-old game. And now it's like, please don't. Like, please don't tell me that she died. Yeah. That would be a spoiler.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was the idea with it, right? They want the second installment to be surprising. Even if it hits some of the same plot beats and some of the same things happen, they want it to be surprising that the same plot beats happen, right? And they've managed to do that.
Which is just wild.
Yeah.
It's freaking wild. That game is off the rails. I don't know who at Square Enix, like, let them do that.
I mean, as much as Nomura is a meme, right? The interviews, at least from Hamaguchi, who's one of the other directors, said that it's actually the original director, who's now producer on this one, Kitase, who's actually pushing for the biggest changes. So it was the guy in charge who was like, change things up, please, for what it's worth.
I guess there aren't that many guys that are, like, higher up at the company than these guys. But
yeah, I mean, they've been there forever.
But it's just, like, I'm imagining, like, going into that pitch meeting and being like, you know, this game that's, like, our cash cow, like, our shining star game that's gonna make us, like, $1 bajillion if we just make a straight remake with voices and stuff. We're actually gonna, like, ruin it. Not ruin it. I'm like being facetious. But like, yeah. We're actually like not gonna make that game. We're gonna make a game that's called that game and like it's a lot like that game, but we're not actually gonna do that. We're gonna put some Heartless in it. And
yeah, I mean, to be honest, like, I guess they answer to shareholders, right? But in terms of creative control, like, they've been there for a very long time now.
And that makes sense. It's just still... I mean, that the hype levels around that game had to be so high just to begin with, just because of what Final Fantasy VII is. And on one hand, you can't make the version of the game that they made, which is like in active conversation with the legacy of this game, without it being a game that everybody already has. That it's just like in the culture.
Yeah.
Right? I can't think of very many other games. And granted, to be fair, like, I am too young to feel that way about Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I haven't played the original. I don't even really know that many. Like, I knew a little about Zack, but only hazily. And, like, obviously, like, everybody knows that Aerith dies. But, like, but, you know, a lot of my problems with the game, as I talked about in our last side quest thing, was, you know, who the heck is Sephiroth? Like, what's going on? But, like, you can't make a game that is being this ballsy about, like, throwing its middle finger to its original version without knowing that this is a game that everybody knows.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating.
I mean, the thing is, like, I think that Final Fantasy VII is one of those games that, like, even if you're not really into games, you're sort of vaguely aware.
Yeah.
Right? Like, Cloud is not exactly Mario, but he's not exactly far off either.
Yeah. I don't think everyone would know his name when they saw him like Mario, but if you showed people a picture of Cloud, I think they'd be able to say that's from a video game.
Yeah.
And not just in the abstract sense of, like,
Yeah.
that looks like a video game character.
Yeah.
But it's also just fascinating because, you know, when you think about it from the perspective of the New York Times, where it's all just a cash grab, which, by the way, they write about Final Fantasy VII in that article without even really, like, acknowledging that it's, like, different.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they made it knowing it was going to make money, and even changing it up, I'm sure they're confident that the next parts will make them plenty of money. But it's hard to look at that and be like, this is just a cash grab.
Right? Because
Yeah.
they easily could have done something so much simpler.
Yeah.
And that would, in theory, have, like, the fans are never happy, right? Like, you're never going to make the capital F fanboys of this game happy, right? Like, Tifa's in a sports bra, we can't have that.
Yeah.
But you definitely could have avoided the, like, conversation around this game, capital C conversation, that happened when it came out, by just making the, not lazy, right? Like, it's always hard to, like, it's not like it would have been easy to make this game in any capacity.
Yeah.
But, like, you definitely could have made the lazy remake, and nobody would have been the wiser.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm interested. It's hard because, again, there's just, like, so few games that are that ubiquitous because, of course, part of the conversation around remakes and remasters is that we need them because we can't play old games.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other can of worms, and you should go listen to our game preservation side quest for, like, more in-depth thoughts on that. But of course, like, a big role that these things play is, like, quote-unquote, introducing the next generation to classic games.
Yeah.
And that's a tricky line to walk. And as much as I would like to see... Like, I was thinking a lot about this in the context of, like, theater and, like, Shakespeare, right?
Sure.
And I would be really interested to see more people taking their old IP and really finding their own way to tell that story. And that's something that is, like, really part of the DNA of theater, right? Is that, like, there's a script and everybody gets the script and there's some rules there, right? And there's some characters and there are some things you can't mess with and have it still be the play. But so much of the DNA of that is you figure out your own way to tell this story. And obviously that's something that's hard it's just harder in other media because there can't be 5 versions of the same TV show happening in 5 different cities at the same time. But I would be really interested to see more remakes take that kind of bold path of, we've got these characters that we can play with and these story beats that we can play with, and what new can we bring to this?
Yeah.
And some of that is hard because the history just isn't there, right? There are so few franchises where the history is ubiquitous enough that that kind of playing around will be noticeable for anyone except, like, games journalists.
Yeah.
But I still think it would be an interesting step forward, even if one that sort of, like, steps away from this being, like, a weird game preservation thing. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, it would be nice if games companies would be more open to preservation. Because I feel like if preservation were more ubiquitous, then maybe you would get more of that, you know? But it's not as meaningful if you're remaking some game that nobody can play anymore, right? Like Final Fantasy VII, you can play on anything, the original. It's on every system, every modern system. So you can go experience the original for yourself whenever you want. You can even get the patch with the better translation if you want now.
Well, it's sort of surprising to me that the game industry hasn't caught up to this, and it might have to do with just the rapidly evolving pace of technology and change of tastes. Like, I'm willing to have that conversation, but it does feel like over this past, I don't know, like maybe 15 years. I don't know, how old is Netflix? I remember having disc Netflix, but anyway, maybe the past 12 years then.
Man, remember disc Netflix?
Right?
I think they still do it, but like...
I think it's a separate company, though. I think it's a different imprint.
Uh-huh.
It's wild, though, right? Yeah, disc Netflix was weird. It
yeah,
wasn't.
we used to get discs, like, all the time.
Yeah. The good old days. That's how we save the Postal Service, is we bring back disc Netflix.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, my point being, I feel like, especially over this last decade, we are in this kind of cultural moment of rewatching things being, like, acceptable and, like, very much a part of how we engage with media, right? Like, rewatching Friends and rewatching The Office is, like, half of the population's personality.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit surprising to me that that isn't something that has caught on in the same way in games, right? Of bringing back content that is nostalgic for people in its original form. Now, obviously games walk in sort of a weird middle ground of, like, you really can't replay the games from the good old days, unless, like, they happen to be the ones that are on every system, like Final Fantasy VII, or unless you happened to hoard your old, like, PS1 or Nintendo 64 in, like, your mom's attic or whatever.
Yeah.
But even if you did do that, like, let's say you do have access to that, even on the same, because of course playing a game on the PS4 is not the same as playing it on the PS1, but whatever. Let's say you have that old system, you saved your games, they still work, and you're not going to sell them to retro game companies. Even then, I feel like it's even harder to recapture that same feeling. Because at least in watching a television show, like, if I go back and I watch Avatar: The Last Airbender, as I did, right, nothing about that show has changed. Whereas, if I'm playing a video game, like, if I'm watching, like, a show that I watched as a kid, or as a high schooler, or as a college student, or whatever, or that I watch over and over and over, if I'm one of those people that just does that with The Office, right? Then, like, that show doesn't change. My reaction to the show might change.
Yeah.
But, like, the show doesn't change. Unless it has blackface in it, in which case episodes get removed. But mostly, the show doesn't change.
Yeah.
Whereas with games, not only does your experience of it necessarily kind of change as you grow, theoretically, in some capacity at least, but also you're a different player than you were. And whether that's you're better at the game or you're worse at the game or whatever it is, literally the content of it changes.
Sure. I can beat Demix now.
Right. Well, again, I was trying to click with Boyfriend, and he was like, so much of my experience with games as a kid was being really bad at them. And it's like, if I went back and played them now, I wouldn't be as bad, and it would be totally different. So it's like, it's hard to capture that same feeling. And of course, the games that looked really cool to you, 15 years ago, don't look good now. And well, that's certainly
fair. I'll say, like, one comparison that I guess you could say across all media is, like, watching something you watched as a kid when you're older and realizing all the, like, dirty jokes that went over your head. Or not even dirty, just, like, adult jokes, Because there's definitely, like Pixar films, for example, always have, like, the humor thrown in for the parents watching. And I think that watching something that you watched as a kid, as a grown-up, you're watching that differently because you're seeing the jokes that are made for you now that you're an adult. Does that make sense?
It does, definitely. I just think, on top of gameless preservation being really hard, I just think, like, I understand the drive to make perpetual remakes and remasters in games, not just from a money perspective, but also just from a, you get to try to capture the same experience now that it would have been in 1997 or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And well, I just feel like because, again, like the tech of games changes so fast that, you know, you might be able to make the game that you wanted to make originally, but you couldn't because you had like the hardware limitations.
Yeah, I mean, I think like stuff like Yakuza is a good example of that. Stuff that was made right when 3D, like if you look at original cutscenes of Yakuza, like they're 3D models that are more sophisticated. They're like the sophisticated Final Fantasy VII ones, right? Like Final Fantasy VII has like 3 different types of 3D model, and it's like Yakuza has like the cutscene ones, right? And it's clear they're trying to film it, you know, like crime movie, you know, but they are just these polygonal 3-dimensional people. Whereas you look at Kiwami 1 and Kiwami 2 now, with their like high definition graphics where Kiryu has pores or whatever.
He has so many pores. It's crazy.
And you can tell, like, this is what they originally intended, right? Like, this is what they wanted it to look like. It's just that now they can actually look like... Well, I mean, they look like video game characters, but they look like human video game characters, if that makes sense.
I admit that I was impressed with how good the cutscene models looked in the original when I was watching. I didn't realize Kiwami was, like, a shot-for-shot remake. I mean, obviously they've added... As you rightly pointed out, and I felt shamed.
I didn't mean to shame you, but like you played like 10 hours now, right?
So I played like 20 hours now.
Like every time a chapter, as in Kiwami, there's like scenes with looking back at what Nishiki went through, right? Yeah. Like those are all new. Those weren't in the original game.
Well, and it wouldn't have been interesting. Like I wouldn't have known who the heck Nishiki was. Those would not have been interesting cutscenes in the original game.
And so,
game.
like,
who the heck is
between Yakuza 0 and the edits they've done to Kiwami, like, Nishiki has become a much more interesting character than he initially was in the release of just Yakuza.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those games are a really interesting case of remakes. Because, so again, like, the cultural perception is remakes are all about nostalgia, and they're about, like, cashing in on people who already love the game. And I think the Yakuza games are really interesting in that they're extending their continuity for people who didn't get into the game until it kind of found an audience in the West.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to me to see those remakes really targeted at an audience that definitely doesn't have familiarity with the original game. And also, I mean, making that story continuity possible. Like, man, I was reading, you have like a 30-second load time between every fight in the original? Heck no. Absolutely not. I already get pissed at how often I accidentally walk into street thugs that I can't sprint away from. You're telling me I have to wait 30 seconds between every fight? Oh my gosh, I would play 20 minutes of that game. No, I wouldn't. Like, the opening cutscene is like an hour. But I would play 20 minutes of that after that and be like, this is too much loading. Absolutely not.
Madelyn's down for the SSD card.
I'm just saying, I'm thinking about how often I do these, like, fights on the street in Yakuza, and if I had to...
I mean, you wonder, were they as frequent in the original, right? Like, how did they work in the original, or did they take some design cues from Zero and how they worked? I honestly don't know, so...
I don't either. I know you can rotate the camera now.
That's good.
But I think that's so fascinating in that like, they've managed to keep the cutscenes with the obvious addition of you actually know and care about Nishiki from Zero, right?
Yeah.
But they managed to keep everything exactly the same while still building in continuity with Zero, which was obviously made, you know, like 15 years later than the original game. It's an interesting tightrope there, because in some ways it's way more faithful and like almost a remaster, and in some ways it's totally new.
Yeah.
I can't believe they didn't have zombies in the original.
There is a zombie
game
that just hasn't come over here. Also like a samurai time period game that
Are
hasn't
you
come
sure?
over
I think
here.
the zombie one maybe has been released in the West, and it's
Oh,
the
really?
samurai one that hasn't been.
Maybe get on that.
Tempting you, yeah. But yeah, like definitely a different motivation behind that one, which is interesting. It's interesting to think about. And like you said, definitely like with that, I was reading about Shadow of the Colossus, right, and how in many ways they felt like they were making the game that they really wanted to make.
See, okay, here's my hot take on Blue Point, who made the Shadow of Colossus remake and is now making the Demon's Souls remake, is that they suck at lighting.
Right, so that's something that I saw, is that
they are awful at it.
The game looks beautiful, but that it loses the distinctive lighting, which in the first place was really a result of hardware limitations.
Yeah, but like both Shadow of the Colossus and Demon's Souls, like I would say the primary color of their original game is yellow, like sort of a muted yellow, and in the remakes the primary color is blue in the lighting. And it just feels, especially in Demon's Souls, like looking at the different screenshots, it's like it just doesn't feel the same. And I don't even have a strong connection to Demon's Souls. I just look at it and like the second screenshot looks better graphically, but the first screenshot looks more visually interesting to me. So like as good work as they do, and as much as they let people like make the games they wanted to make or whatever, I just think that they're literally terrible at lighting, and maybe picking games that use lighting so much for their atmosphere is maybe they should have worked on it a little bit more.
How do you feel about Tony Hawk being set in the time of Corona?
Is it? Did they change the time period?
There's like because first of all of the old skaters are like in it as like 40-year-old men.
Oh right, yeah, I did know that.
But yeah, there's like a billboard out that's referencing like how schools are out and like stay safe, everyone.
That's funny.
And so I saw somebody writing about it. I can't remember if it was Twitter or a review or something. It's like, you know what? It actually does kind of justify like why this city is like empty.
Yeah.
Because like everyone is inside. Not that I needed that justification for my Tony Hawk, but you know.
Yeah. I did watch one of Polygon's videos on Tony Stark
Pro Skater.
Tony
Man, Marvel Avengers took a real turn, huh?
The original, and how they had, I can't remember what it's called now, but like a pit of spikes that they specifically called after some like Vietnam War like trap. I can't remember what the thing is called now, and he the guy was like emailing all the developers like trying to find out why it was called that, and the answer was really just like probably some movies we watched. I don't know. I wish I could remember what it was called, but it's just some recent Polygon video on it, and it does not exist in the remake in like the skate zone builder. You cannot put it in, so it's not there anymore, which I find funny.
Saving it for the DLC.
Yeah.
The Vietnam pack. Tony Hawk Pro Skater, I mean, I'll throw this out here because it's a remakes remasters conversation. I mean, a big thing that hinders remakes and remasters and game preservation in general, right, is music licenses. Right. So the fact that they were ever able to remake Pro Skater at all, I don't know what the music is like in this, but I think a lot of it is the same.
Yeah, I think they got a lot of the licenses back, yep.
So that's a big thing that just gets in the way. It's just like on top of everything else.
Yeah, I remember like Alan Wake was, I think, delisted for a while because it lost the licenses to a lot of its music for a bit, and only recently got it back and is now back on systems. Speaking of Remedy Entertainment, next-gen upgrades sure are weird,
man.
Aren't they?
They gave it to everybody.
Like, the thing is, I can sort of sympathize, right? Like, I assume that making the next gen upgrades cost money, and I don't know how much support. I assume they're getting support from Microsoft, but I don't know if Sony's giving them any support. So I can appreciate the fact that, like, well, maybe we don't want to put this effort in and not get paid for it, but also if you can just give everybody the version with the next gen upgrades, I don't know, maybe that's a little sus, man. Or maybe you could sell it as like a $10 add-on or something instead of making them rebuy the game.
There's no way to win.
Yeah.
This whole next gen upgrade thing, there's just no way to win.
Yeah, was it Call of Duty that like tweeted out their incredibly convoluted next gen thing?
I didn't see that, but I believe it.
I think it was Call of Duty that they were like, people with this edition don't get it on the PlayStation 5, but do get it on the Series X, and people with this edition do get it on the PlayStation 5, but don't get it on the Series X, or something like that, which was weird. So I think that is going to cause a lot of problems in the next year.
It's just, like, when did Control came out like a year ago, right? More than that?
Yeah, something like that.
It's just like, I think it's too much to expect a game from a non-AAA studio to give you...
The issue is that they released the Ultimate Edition
right,
with all the DLC for like $80, or whatever it's called. The one that doesn't have the next gen upgrades was like $80, and the one that does is like $40. I think is the main issue that people are having.
I think people are babies.
I mean, I understand being a little upset. You know, you bought this thing for $80 and you get all the same content as the $40 one, but you don't get it on the PlayStation 5. I don't know.
I guess, but who has a TV that's nice enough that it's going to matter anyway? Most people. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. We're not to 8K yet, in which case we will not even be able to perceive the difference. And what is the point? But we will get it one day. Even people who it's like 180p versus like 4K or whatever. I don't believe that people can see the difference.
I think people can see the difference between 180p and 4K, Emma.
Are they the same?
180p is like, I think you were like trying to say like 1800.
Oh, 1080p, I'm sorry.
I was like, 180p?
1080p versus like 4K. I don't believe that anyone could see the difference. I just don't.
There it is. Emma's dropping the vision science on us here.
I don't believe it. It's not because I have bad eyesight.
I don't believe in vision. Do you want to talk about The World Ends With You? I feel like I have to give you space for that.
Oh, sure. I can talk about The World Ends With You a little bit. I mean, stuff like that is... The DS is just such a...
weird
system, right? Like, it just... I mean, all of Nintendo's systems are a little bit weird. Let's be real. Like, they differ so wildly from each other. Even as they, you know, sometimes create confusing names for them. But, yeah, like, trying to port something that actually used the DS in all of its glory, right, is very hard. Because the DS has touchscreen, a microphone, and 2 screens. And the 3DS, if you want to go wild with it, had 3D, technically. So, like, trying to bring something like The World Ends With You that on the DS made use of the touchscreen and the 2 screens and the microphone, technically, although I don't consider that a huge loss, to be honest. I remember getting to a fight where you're required to use one where you scream into the mic, like, on the metro somewhere once. and I had to just close it. I was like, well, can't do that here. And so, like, the result is you get a game that's still a very good game and definitely prettier and has cool new music remixes, but it's just fundamentally not the same in a way that's not, like, intended, right? Like, they were like, we need to bring it to this, like, it's forced. It's forced to be different, rather than making a choice to be different, because it has to conform to what the Switch is.
Totally. And that's the danger, right? The other side of the coin of designing really specifically for a system, which I'm sure is why people don't do it.
Yeah.
Is that, man, it's really, really cool when you get a game that really makes use of what's unique about a console or a handheld or whatever it is. But when you do that, it means that you can't bring it anywhere else without really overhauling it. And that's hard. So it makes me sad, but it does make me understand why we don't see as much of that.
Yeah. I'm just glad I still have my copy for my 3DS.
Look at you, little hoarder.
Yeah, I do hoard. Still have my copy of 358 over 2 days, too. Did me. Making a movie version, please.
Wow, I want to point out in our notes you refer to it as 356 over 2.
Whatever.
It's like, are you a real fan?
I got confused, okay? Give me a break.
A couple of those days don't really matter. They could cut a couple days if they needed to.
I'm just saying, if Nomura is bored with his, like, 8 projects and would like to make a full remake... This is probably the secret
project he's teasing.
And would like to make a full remake of 358 over 2 days, I would pay $60 for that. Maybe even $80. Okay?
Oh, but he would add new scenes. Like, it would...
That's fine. That's fine.
He'd be like, Kirthi was there the whole time.
Kirthi was there. I just want, like, I want the organization Moogle to show up in cutscenes, you know?
You're right.
That, like, nobody who watched that movie got to experience Organization Moogle. And truly, can you call yourself a Kingdom Hearts fan if you don't know about the 15th member, Moogle X?
Kingdom Hearts does have a good example of a game that is better in the remaster than, I mean, other than all of the Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix purists and the floaty combat people who I'm just going to put in their own little camp. Yeah. Right? But I'm thinking of Chain of Memories, because Chain of Memories is nigh impossible to play, at least as a 10-year-old, on the Game Boy Advance, and becomes much easier to play, even in the PS2 version remake, that only came out 3 years after the original.
And even that was still hard to play.
Yeah. For
a 10-year-old.
Right. I did beat that as an 18-year-old, so it only took 8 years. But yeah, just like pointing out, sometimes we see remakes that are, like, as opposed to, like, are cynical or whatever, like, genuinely, like, they are better. Even if it's, you know, more of a remaster or more of a port or whatever it is. Sometimes they find a home.
So one more thing I kind of want to touch on a little bit, and this could probably, like, be its own little episode, so we don't have to go too deep into it, but, like, video games have, like, a pretty long history of fan remakes, which is something I'm curious, like, if it exists or ever existed in, like, the movie industry at all, with, like, movie students, like, remaking films. Like, black and white films in color with, like, fancy digital equipment.
Oh, that reminds me. You know what very unflattering comparison Clickbait Boyfriend brought to my attention for Final Fantasy VII Remake?
Sure.
He was like, it's like George Lucas and the Star Wars movies.
Oh, dear.
He's like, they've decided to, like, they've added an Anakin. Han didn't shoot first.
I don't think it's quite like that.
I know. It was facetious, but
Yeah.
That's one famous movie remake that I'll throw out there. Anyway, go on.
But I don't know anything about that for movies. But in video games, there's definitely a lot of people who work on fan remakes or fan games or whatever. And sometimes you get stuff like Black Mesa, which is pretty much like Valve is like, you're cool.
Yeah, it's almost not even, except that they didn't get paid. It's like basically an official.
Yeah. Versus anybody trying to make a remake of a Nintendo game, in which case Nintendo comes down on them with the fire of 1,000 suns.
It's wild how many people have like made their own Pokemon games.
Yeah. Somebody, or at least was, doing like a remake of Three Houses that makes it in the old art style of the original Fire Emblem.
That's wild.
Which I thought was super cute. Or people were making like a Resident Evil 2 remake when they announced like their official remake. I don't know if they ended up shutting them down or not, but they weren't at the time of the article I was reading. And like I was curious about that because I was a little like, I'm not a copyright lawyer.
Really?
But my general understanding, and from like the cursory research I did, is like, I don't understand why this wouldn't. I guess because they're remaking the same thing, but it feels similar to like any fan fiction or whatever, which is like legal as long as you're not profiting off of it, right? So I'm not sure why, like companies have I mean, maybe it's just because fan work people can't hire lawyers to fight Nintendo, right? But I'm not sure what the legal ground Nintendo has to like shut down fan games that aren't for profit.
Why is fan fiction legal?
Because it's transformative. Falls under fair use.
Okay, so fair use is a legal defense, though. Like, fair use gets thrown around as a thing that it isn't really. So that's why, I mean, I'm sure that's why. Maybe these fan games are legal, but you're absolutely right. The problem with fair use is that it's not like a law, it's like a legal doctrine, basically. And so even if you could win the court case, you'd have to, like, survive that.
Yeah. I mean, that was my initial theory, right?
Yeah.
It's like, if somebody did that. I think at this point, stuff like fan fiction is pretty, safe.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to, like, obviously, it's obvious to me that fan fiction exists in a legal area that, like, no one is gonna, like, it's accepted, even if it isn't strictly legal.
I mean, just fan work in general, like, a lot of, stuff, like, that's just free marketing for you in a lot of ways, right? Like, games and movies and TV shows with big fan work communities, coming down on those is just going to lose them money in the end.
I will say, though, that, like, obviously, except, like, maybe for, like, novels, right? But obviously fan fiction is not directly competing with, like, a movie, right? Like,
sure.
If I want to watch a movie, I'm not going to be satisfied by reading some stories about the movie, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, like, video game fan works definitely fall a lot closer to being, like, if they're actually good, fall a lot closer to being a potential genuine threat. Especially when they, like all the, like, Pokemon, like, fan, like, creations that pop up every couple of years, like, always do a better job making a Pokemon game than Nintendo does.
Sure.
And that's not a rip at Sword and Shield. That's just like a rip at the older Pokemon games, to be honest. Of, like, it's like they do a better job of, like, there's a user interface, or, like, there's an actual story, or whatever it is, or, like, you can catch all the Pokemon, or whatever. Like, they always do a better job at, like, solving common complaints that Nintendo obviously has no interest in solving. So I could certainly see in those cases that seeming like, I mean, whatever. It's hard to think of anything being a genuine competitor to Nintendo.
Yeah, like, that's why I generally, like, roll my eyes when it's like Nintendo comes after people hosting their old games that they don't sell anywhere. Like now, like, I'm pretty sure Nintendo is one of the, like, they just announced they're, like, one of the richest companies in Japan. If not the richest company. So, like, I'm not gonna feel sorry for them because people like their games and want to make things based off their games, you know? Like, the people making these aren't people who hate or don't buy those games.
I know.
You know? They're not, maybe in very rare cases, but generally if they're working on something like that, they are also encouraging people to buy, you know, products from the company that they're working off of.
Well,
you know?
You would just never hear about something like that if you weren't already part of the community.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard to imagine, like, I can't imagine, especially with something as ubiquitous as, like, Pokemon.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, like, you've heard of Pokemon. Like, it's not like this is you're thinking this is the game.
Yeah.
It's just crazy. I mean, and that's why I think, I mean, bringing this kind of full circle, that's why I think this All-Stars, 3D All-Stars Gambit is so ridiculous. Like, surely Nintendo has made way more money in the first 2 fiscal quarters this year than they expected to, right? Like, Animal Crossing sold like crazy. So, like, why are they pulling this bizarre, transparent fiscal year, like, arrangement when it's obvious that they're having a good year?
Yeah. I mean, they're releasing, like, the next Hyrule Warriors, right? That's Breath of the Wild universe. That's gonna sell like hotcakes. Like, I don't... Yeah, it just feels... I don't know. If there's one thing from our games preservation podcast, too, is just to remember that games companies aren't your friends. And that's something you should bear in mind.
I do wonder if Nintendo is just savvier than, like, to bring it back to you being like, Atlas was so shocked that this game sold well for them and people wanted it. And I do wonder if Nintendo, as a company that has some really core IP, is savvier than most about the value of these old games. And if Super Mario 3D All-Stars does turn out to be a Disney Vault genuine situation where they do actually take it away, at least for a time, on March 31st, then that will be obvious that they actually realize that being able to remake these games, or even just release them as ports, is a really viable revenue stream for them as a company that does a lot of work that's, I mean, good work. Like, I'm not here to, like, rag on the quality of Nintendo's work, but does a lot of work that is nostalgia-based and sales that are nostalgia-driven. I wouldn't be surprised that they're just more aware that having this stuff hidden away and having people scared of them, and where they get to have it out there when they want to, is a way to make a lot of money.
Maybe.
So, you know. Screw you, capitalism!
Hey, though, if Intelligent System wants to remake the Ike games and put them on Switch...
Emma's here to buy that.
I'm saying, I'm here to buy that.
Well, folks, do you have a favorite remake or remaster that you've played? Or do you have a game that you wish would get remade, remastered, ported, whatever, that just can't seem to make it out into this space? Do you think original IP is dead? Do you have thoughts about Tifa's sports bra? Don't tell us those.
Please don't share those. We don't want to know.
Please keep the latter to yourself. But anything else related to this episode, hit us up on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. And there you can keep up with everything that's happening on our website, the latest about the show. On YouTube, you can keep up with Emma's series, On Topic Corner, and Play This. All sorts of good stuff in the archives there. she talked about some games that we talk about on the show today. You talked about Yakuza Kiwami in one of the episodes.
Yeah.
Probably there are other ones. That's the one that I can remember.
I talked about the Rollins with you.
Oh, right. So if you want more content about some of the games that came up today, that exists on YouTube. Check that out. You should also go take a look at our website. We're at www.talkthispodcast.com. And while you're there, you can read more about the show, see the games that are in the hat that we use for our main quest editions, read about me and Emma, like as of whenever we wrote our bios, and check out the blog, which features long-running series clickbait boyfriend that is done, sort of.
Yeah!
It's up to date on the Kingdom Hearts games, minus the mobile games, because we just can't, right? Like, we just can't.
See, the funny thing is, I find the mobile game, like, story, like, really compelling. So, if they want to remake that into, like, an MMO, Final Fantasy XIV style, I'm just saying.
Emma's in danger. Anyway, Clickbait Boyfriend obviously will return in November with Melody of Memory, when I will spend the $60 for that game. I feel ripped off, but whatever. I know it's a lot of content. I just, when I saw that price tag, I was like, come on, throw me a bone. Anyway, we'll be back in November, but we might have some content about a game we talked about today, wink wink, featuring the work of Tetsuya Nomura, wink wink, coming eventually, who knows. You'll have to wait and see. But also on their split screen, where Emma and I are watching Coffee Prince and My Hero Academia, and you gotta go, because Emma made a fan cam. I wrote that intro being like, haha, like, she's not actually gonna make it, like, I'm just gonna be funny, and apparently it worked.
I'm really proud of my work.
So definitely tune in for the All Might Shrek fan cam. And also, like, other blog content coming soon. I know Emma's got a bunch of stuff in the works. I've got an anime recap in the works. I had forgotten I watched Dorohedoro. That almost didn't make it, because I just forgot about it, even though it was great.
They've all got masks.
I know. Relatable. Anyway, lots of good stuff on the blog. You don't want to miss that. And finally, if you don't want to miss the show on Sundays at noon, you should subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app. Anywhere that you can find podcasts, you can find Talk This. Emma, do you remember what's up next week?
Some games.
It was something I remember being like, oh yeah, like, I know what that is.
Mass Effect and Sayonara Wild Hearts, right?
That's what it was. I'm gonna have to play a little bit of that again. So check that out next week. In 2 weeks, Emma will be back with her side quest topic of this cycle, and the show just goes on and on and on. Apparently, we're getting close to our 100th main quest, as Emma tells me. I don't know how close.
I think this is next week will be 96.
Wow.
Yeah.
Crazy people. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, everybody. This was a fun one. I had a fun one with this episode. Emma, do you want to say goodbye to everyone?
I hope this week is made just perfect the first time.